The interesting thing about reading on characters in the Bible, like you normally would in a setting such as a church or a Bible study, is that you never really think about the social background some of these characters live in. In the Hebrew Bible, as literature book, it states that in a shorter narrative such as the Book of Ruth or the Book of Esther, one finds more of a snapshot in which a character is presented to the reader. Characters like Jacob or David or Abigail, when we read about them, they seem to live in this realm of ambiguity because we don't know much about the background to paint a better picture. In reality, the social world of ancient Israel, which is where these characters would have lived, actually has a lot of depth to it. If you break down ancient Israel to its most basic unit, you would get the household. A typical household would include a husband, his wife or wives, all of his children, and all of his livestock. There's a lot of emphasis on the male family member because the Israelites focused a lot on patrilineage, especially when it came to passing down land. Usually the father passes the inheritance down to his eldest son, though there are some instances in the Bible where that isn't always the case. But for the most part, it was the son who would pass things down to his son, and then his son would pass it down to his son, and so on. The Oxford Study Bible states that nuclear families in rural peasant cultures would include on average 5 to 7 members. We might sit back today and think that's a pretty large number, but back then that was considered pretty average given the fact that the mortality rate of children was very high at this time. Households would also be built fairly close together, and they were rarely secluded. In instances like this, the term clan could come into play because if you're expanding your family, then your household is going to get bigger, and you're going to want to build houses that are close together to keep your family close together. So that's where the term clan would come in. If you look beyond the household, you get the village and or the city. Depending on factors such as water supply, and the fertility of land, you have instances where small villages would grow into big cities. But for the most part, villages and cities worked alongside each other. Since villages were set up in rural area, this means farmland, so they would provide the city with food, and in return, the city would provide protection of the village. The city would provide the village protection from outsiders. And when you get to cities, this is where you really start to see social structures come into play, because in a city, this is where you get sort of a class system. You have the merchants, you have military leaders, you have the priests, you have political leaders, royalty, administrations, and they would usually take up about 10% of the population. And obviously, the more higher you are in society, the bigger your house would be, or the more important you would be. And if you go beyond the city, you get the king, or well, that would be part of the city, but you you basically get forms of government, and with every government you may have, there may be instances where you would get the chief, or the chief would rule over certain areas while you have an overall king to the state. And with this kind of background knowledge, you sort of get an idea of the characters in the Bible and where they might have lived in and how their lives might have been, instead of this ambiguity that we feel when we read about certain characters. We don't necessarily know the environment that they live in, and this kind of environment, the household, the cities and villages, and then when you get to a chief and a king, it paints a better picture of how these characters lived.